liners, welcome back to the channel Transmission Lines Engineering TV. This is the chapter number 7 of this series of videos, Wiring the World, in which we will talk about the regions of Australia and Cuba, how it was the electrical development in these regions. So we will start with Australia. Australia, it's an extensive continent, but with a very dry climate in its majority. In fact, it is the driest in the world. Because of this reason, its more important cities and communities are located in the coastal areas, except for very small populations in the central regions of the continent. At the end of the 19th century, in 1878, electricity was used for the very first time, and in 1880, the Victorian Electric Light Company was formed with headquarters in the city of Melbourne to supply the eastern of Australia. The first public service registered in Australia was in 1888 in the town of Tamworth, where the public lighting of an avenue was lit, and another one in 1899 in the town of Young, where it also illuminated an avenue. The Tamworth system operated by means of 240 volts in DC generation facility, which was the first three-phase system used in Australia. Actually, Tasmania was the first region to be electrified by means of transmission lines, and in 1916, an 88 kV line was put into service with 100 kilometers from the Wadamana electric plant to the Tasmania capital city, Hobart. Later on, in 1924, another generation project was carried out in Latrobe Valley with a 132 kV transmission line with 160 kilometers length, which connected this population with the city of Melbourne. The areas of Tasmania and Victoria were those that had the more accelerated development. In the case of Victoria, lines up to 220 kV lines were installed by 1956, and 500 kV lines were installed in 1970. The areas of Western Australia and Queensland were regions where electrification had some setbacks because of problems in their governments for the electrical development due to the post-war, until in 1957 in southwest Australia, the Bunbury regeneration plant that will interconnect this city with Perth was completed. At present, Australia is a self-sufficient country in the supply of electric power, since during the decades of the 1950s, 70s and 80s, a great impulse was given to the energy infrastructure in Australia and Tasmania. Now we will talk about the electrical development of Cuba. Like other regions in the world, the electrification in Cuba was due to the lighting of its streets and avenues. The energy history of Cuba had to go through several political challenges during the times of the Cuban Revolution and during the Cold War. The Cuban economy was based fundamentally on the cultivation of sugar cane that required the electrification of the area in order to increase its competitiveness. By 1902, many American companies formed large businesses in Cuba. In 1908, the first two-phase alternating current systems were implemented in the cities of Matanzas and Cardenas. Later, in 1910, another electricity network was installed to supply the community of Caibarien, and then extended to the community of Villa de Remedios, and the public parks of the city of Cienfuegos was energized. The Cuban electrical system continued to grow until the hydroelectric power station of Janabanilla was put into service in 1913. By 1923, Another generating plant with 3-phase engines was inaugurated to supply the city of La Habana and Matanzas, which was the Talapiedra power station. At the end of the First World War, the United States began to acquire more Cuban production companies in Santiago in 1923 and La Habana between 1927 and 1928, forming a monopoly that had about 4,500 kilometers of transmission lines between distribution and supplying electricity to 165 communities. At the end of the Second World War, Cuba did not really have an expansion in its electrical systems as other nations, basically due to financing problems. It was only managed to make improvements to the existing plants between 1948 to 1957. Now, during the times of the Cuban Revolution in 1960, the electrical Cuban installations were turned over to the revolutionary state, so the totality of the Cuban electrical infrastructure turned into a service of public character. On the other hand, an interesting period in the expansion of the Cuban electrical systems were the times of the Cold War. In 1966, when the generating equipment coming from the Soviet Union was installed in the thermoelectric plants of Antonio Maceo and Maximo Gomez, with the support of the commander Ernesto Che Guevara, who gave a very strong impulse to the Cuban electrical system at that time. By 1975, the installed capacity of 1958 had tripled, and the number of thermoelectric power stations in Cuba was increased. Before the Cuban Revolution, the country had about 13,000 kilometers of transmission lines, and by 1975, Cuba had 32,000 kilometers of transmission lines, and the National Electroenergetic System, CEN, was created. At the beginning of 1980, the construction of 2 power plants was approved in Jaragua, province of Cienfuegos, which has been dismantled, and one more in the province of Holguín. Finally, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost most of its fuel suppliers for its nuclear plants as well as equipment spare parts. With this, Cuba faced the serious problem that its generating plants were seriously affected by the lack of spare parts, in which the demand greatly exceeded the generation, causing the price of electric service to increase. In light of this situation, Cuba has had to make the use of national consumption of hydrocarbons to feed its very own generation plants. So, very quickly, this was the history of the continents of Australia and Cuba. In the next chapter, we will talk about the electrical development of Central and South America. So I hope to have the privilege of your company for the next video. So see you on the next one. Transmission Lines Engineering TV, training to power the world.